Hello friends, and welcome back to the Steps of Baking series. This is a 13-part video series in which we take a closer look at each of the steps of the bread baking process, from weighing out ingredients to cooling your bread down after baking. Each of these steps is just as important as the next, and each of them will affect the end result. The previous episode was about shaping, and in this week's episode we'll talk about final fermentation or final proofing, which is a step that comes after shaping. Final fermentation is the phase between shaping and baking your bread. Now, unless the bread is being retarded in the fridge overnight, this step is mainly for gaining volume, because most of its flavor would have been developed during the bulk fermentation stage. And depending on what kind of bread you're making, it may be fermented on a tray, in a bread basket, between baker's linen, in bread tins, but either way, make sure you cover it so it doesn't dry out and form a thick crust. It is up to the baker to judge for how long the bread should be proofed. There are too many variables in every recipe to give a precise time. Only experience will be able to help you in telling when it's ready. But generally speaking, you don't want your bread to rise fully before you bake it. If your dough has overproofed, then it will most likely collapse whilst baking. But if it's underproofed, then it will not rise properly. Now, a lot of recipes will say you need to wait for it to double in size. And while that generally is the way to go, it is not obviously always correct. A well-proofed bread will be light to the touch. If you poke it with your finger, the indentation should come out slowly. If you shake the loaf, it should have a little jiggle about it. It is always easier to tell if a large loaf has risen enough, because you can clearly see the difference. If you're making flatbread like ciabatta, or some little buns, or some cinnamon rolls, it's a little bit more difficult to tell. That's why I like to include these time lapses in my videos, so you can clearly see how the bread is rising. If you are making yeasted bread, and it has been fermenting rapidly, then 30 minutes or so final proofing should be sufficient sometimes. But if you're making sourdough bread, which ferments really slowly, then it may take up to 3-4 hours or so. In this example, I'm making fougasse. It was fermenting quickly, so 30 minutes was more than enough. Look at it rise. And up next, we have an example of a dough that's being fermented overnight in the fridge. Refrigerating your dough will really slow down the fermentation, and a long cold final proof will give your sourdough bread an even more pronounced sour flavor. And as you can see, it's nicely risen, and if I shake it, it's got a wobble about it. But that's final fermentation for you. If your dough is warm and fermenting rapidly, proof it for less time. If it's cool and fermenting slowly, then leave it for longer. You can't trust bread baking recipes, not mine, not anyone's, because there are just too many variables that affect the final fermentation and the whole process, really. But the more you bake, the more you practice, the better you'll get at telling when it's ready. And as always, if you have any questions or suggestions, drop them down in comments. I have recipes for all of these breads that you saw in this video on my channel. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.